So this lesson is on budgeting and basic financial management in athletic training. And this is going to be one of the easiest and most difficult um, lessons that we have in athletic training administration. And the reason for that is because everything is fairly straightforward as far as a lot of definition level knowledge that you need to know. The difficult problem comes is in both the individualization of how this process works for each institution, while at the same time just the sheer volume of the different definitions and accounting type principles that we need to know. So I'm going to kind of introduce the basic process and give some basic analysis of what I want you to know. And then your third page notes assignments will really be the bulk of what you need to know for this lesson. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we think of budgeting in the budget, right, this is both a noun and a verb as far as a way. And the reason I bring that up is because it's a way of thinking, right? We have a fixed item that we call the budget, and this is the monies available for purchasing. But we also need to think of the budget as an interactive process of both aligning what we spend our money on with our programmatic goals and objectives, while at the same time also being collaborative in nature to help identify where and how these monies are spent. So this basic budget process that you can see here, right, starts with planning, gathering feedback, building consensus, all the way through with that. This is the process of budgeting, the verb of budgeting, and each one of these is relatively simple to understand. Planning is obviously thinking about what our overall goals and objectives are, gathering feedback, and building consensus or getting other people involved. And then you go through the process of finalizing the budget, getting it approved, and then implementing it, and then wrapping it up with evaluation. So basically, there is not a large difference between budgeting processes in athletic training and elsewhere. The one important thing to consider is usually the budget is the responsibility of one athletic trainer, but it is very important to include all athletic trainers within the budgeting process. So the first couple of definitions to understand, first is the budgeting cycle, and second is the fiscal year. Now, these often get used interchangeably, but they really shouldn't. The budget cycle includes that planning and evaluation, so it's going to be longer than the standard fiscal year if the budget is for a fiscal year, which is most common. You can have short-term budgets, long-term budgets, you can have monthly budgets, but this fiscal year is an accounting term that basically divides the year into an operating year, and funds are then calculated throughout that year, and it's often different than a calendar year, but it represents the same sort of thing, how the finances are spent in one year. That could include one budget cycle, it could include multiple budget cycles, it could be half of a budget cycle. It really depends. So even though these are used interchangeably, that is mainly because the fact that they don't include, people aren't including a lot of planning or evaluation within their budgeting cycle, and then they have a single budgeting cycle within a fiscal year. Couple other things to understand with that is these short-term and long-term budgets. These are relative terms, short term and then long term. You can have short term, usually referring to an annual budget, could be even smaller than that with that, but then longer term budget is for more expensive things that would require monies outside of the annual budget. From there, you have things like the operational budget and the equipment and supplies budget. You can see what can be included in there. Salaries, administration costs, and office operations with this are included. And it's recommended that you start with this operational budget when building out your budget, because this is going to represent the largest amount of expenditure usually for a given organization. Equipment and supplies are just what that says, right? There can be expendable, non-expendable supplies, and basically, and then capital expenses or capital supplies. And basically, this is based off of the cost and lifespan. And each organization often has their own definition for what is expendable, what is non-expendable, and what is capital. Oftentimes, expendable is just things that cannot be reused at all. It's a one and done sort of thing. Non-expendable things are of a lower cost with a minimum lifespan, usually less than 3 years with that. And then capital can either be more expensive equipment, usually over $1,000 in total cost, or have a lifespan over 3 years. And the idea here is that expendable and non-expendable items are often put into the short-term annual budget, whereas capital items need a longer-term capital budgeting process. There's also fixed and variable expenses. Fixed expenses are things that do not change regarding the amount that you need. And they have some sort of known cost. So like if you were to purchase a piece of equipment, that would be a fixed expense. However, something like tape would be a variable expense. If you have more athletes or you're taping more, it would cost more, and vice versa. So fixed and variable expenses. Limited budgets and rollover budgets. This has to do with the end of the budget cycle. At the end of a budget cycle, a limited budget, which is most common, zeroes out. So like this brings up the idea, if you don't spend it, you lose it, where people spend money at the end of the budgeting cycle because if they don't spend it, they lose it. A rollover budget allows for whatever is not spent in one budget cycle to be rolled over and added to the next budget cycle. One thing to keep in mind as we discuss these classifications in systems, that these can be compounded and often are. Right? You can have a limited line item budget or a rollover line item budget. And so you can see that these are often put into practice using multiple things. So line item budgeting is basically taking the amount of funds for the program or for the institution and then creating line items across the institution. So you might have a line item for travel. You might have a line item for copying. You might have a line item for equipment. And so that way, across the entire organization, every expenditure within that category would be classified according to that line item. So the institution would be able to see how much they spent on travel regardless of the program with that. And then there are all sorts of different institutional rules associated with a budget on whether or not you can easily transfer money back and forth. So like if you had an equipment budget and a travel budget and you were under on the travel budget, would that doesn't necessarily mean that you would be allowed to spend it on the on equipment. And so that is an institutional rule on at what level they allow transferring to occur. Programmatic budgeting is very similar to a line item budget. It just has much more specific categories associated with the program, whereas line item budgeting is much more institutional wide. Program budget is more program based, as the name implies. Incremental budgeting and zero-based budgeting. And this, again, you can have an incremental line item budget, you can have a zero-based line item budget. What these are is it comes up with what the next budgeting cycle looks like. In a zero-based budgeting cycle, you start from scratch every single year. So the assumption with zero-based budgets is that each year or each budget cycle, you would need to justify the amount of money that you were going to spend for every line item, every different aspects for each budget. Right? So you would start with 0, and you would then say, this year I'm going to need $5,000 for travel, and I'm going to need, $4,000 for equipment, and so on and so forth. And then that would be part of the planning and approval process. Incremental budgeting has to do with, okay, so now it's like last year I got $3,000 for travel and everything got a 10% increase. So now I would start with that $3,000 and add 10% across the board or for each line item. And it just starts at that new level. Based off of this incremental budgeting, increase, decrease, all that. The problem with incremental budgeting is very much that the assumption is that budgets will, whatever was determined way back when the original budget was implemented is still applicable. And that has the ability to create some of this budget fat that they determine, which is basically spending money on things that aren't priorities anymore, but have already been or have always been spent. The problem with zero-based budgeting is, although it eliminates that, it creates a great amount of time. And that's similar to the PPBS budgeting, which really is very uncommon and not even worth really discussing. It's just a special type of zero-based budget. You can also have then fixed and variable budget systems. A fixed budget system basically sets the amount of funds that you have for that budgeting cycle ahead of time, and it's completely reliant on estimates of funds, whereas variable budget cycles or flexible budget cycles will change the amount of money based on the amount of revenue that is coming in. So usually you will have fixed-based budget systems in larger organizations and more variable budget systems in smaller situations. As I kind of hinted at the beginning, it comes down to this: each budgeting rules and regulations are set by the institution that you work, right? And so larger institutions tend to have more complex requirements. If you work for a state institution that receives state dollars, then there's all sorts of additional regulations with that as far as what sort of requirements there are for purchasing, how you can go about spending money. And so it really is a very complicated situation when you get into the institutional dynamics on whether or not you as the athletic trainer purchase it, whether you have a purchasing manager that purchases it, whether or not bids are required, whether an open bid is required, all sorts of different rules and regulations, which are really more complicated than what we can get into. We'll just kind of talk about some of that as well. Another thing to consider in clinics is this idea of revenue centers and cost centers. And revenue centers are things that operate a net profit, and cost centers are things that do not produce a profit, but instead are essential or are part of the service component of that organization. And so this is where athletic training often gets the short end, because it's considered a cost center most of the time, because we do not directly bill for our services in athletic training most of the time. And most of the assets that we bring are either through referrals to revenue centers. You refer them to a physician or physical therapy group, or through advertising. So I mentioned the individual aspect of that and mentioned this idea of bids and competitive bids. And so these are all of the terms that's important for you to know in this process. But basically, when you look at these process, you can either have a simple purchase, which is basically you review the items from the different vendors and you purchase them however those vendors are. You have the ability to purchase those. You get a purchase order, which is basically a promise to pay for the things. You agree to the terms and ships the items, you receive it, and you pay the invoice. That's the simple aspect. But oftentimes, especially in state schools, you have these requirements for bids and other aspects with that. Now, what a bid and the bidding process is oftentimes based on the volume that you purchase, you can get better prices. So specifically in athletic training, you would look at, Henry Schein, Medco, those sorts of things, and you would say, these are all of the things that I would like to purchase. What price could you give me on that? And so then they will come back and say, based on your purchasing history, these are the prices for each individual item. Now, sometimes that has to be a cumulative bid. So like in order to get the price on tape, you would also have to buy your scissors there or whatever, or sometimes they can be item specific. And so you want your bid to most closely resemble what you want to purchase, so that way you can get the appropriate pricing and the best aspect. Sometimes in smaller organizations like high schools or wherever, they pool together as a school district, and so they will buy all their tape together under one order and then ship it out to the different schools, so that way you can get better prices. But you put together what you want are. And so some of these get into like very specific item descriptions and blind bids and stuff. So depending on the rules and regulations, you may not even be allowed to quote unquote choose your tape. So like you might just put down athletic tape and then you're required to bid it out, and then they will choose whatever the cheapest tape it is. Sometimes you can get into the specifications, which is the specifications for the bid basically say the requirements for that aspect. So if you had very specific tape, oftentimes the vendors are pretty good at creating specifications for you that only allow their product to occur. But there are some government organizations and all that which basically don't allow you to choose the specific brand name that you want. Instead, you're just required to go with whatever the cheapest is based on this blind bid. And that's where oftentimes this idea of substitutions then can come into play with the bid, where you might bid out for like David knee braces, and they substitute in their Medco knee braces or knee sleeves with that, just the cheaper, non name brand version. And so with that, depending on the organization, you may or may not be allowed to reject some of those substitutions are in there. And that's working directly with your purchasing department and the purchasing delegate. And then lastly, all of this obviously is based off of inventory. Inventory is only as good as the priority that it's made. You can have very complicated computer-based systems or just use simple Excel spreadsheets. but you need to be taking inventory to know what you have, as well as then year over year, you will know what you used. One of the biggest problems that people have with the budgeting process is that instead of purchasing based off of their inventory, they purchase based off of the previous year's purchase. And so if they ordered a bunch of tape, right, and then they had a bunch of tape left over, they would not necessarily know how much tape they had. They just know that they didn't use all they had, so they would decrease the order of tape. Ideally, you would be able to know exactly how much tape, how much of different supplies you're using year over year. So that way you can both keep track of all of your stuff, which is part of the inventory, but also be able to purchase based on what you have. So if you need 75 cases of tape a year, right, and so last year you ordered 75, but this year, and then you ended with 25. So if you purchase based off of your inventory, you would know that you would only need to buy 25 cases of tape because you only used 50 cases of tape. But if you purchase based off of the last year's purchasing, you would say, I bought 75, I still have 25 left over, so I only need 50, and you'd buy 50 cases of tape, right? And so that's the idea with the inventory process. So bringing all that together, and that's the basic budgeting ideas. With that, spend a significant amount of time making sure you understand those terms so that way you're prepared for the exam. If you have any questions, as always, love to chat more with you. See you in class.